The kind of Oslo blockchain days have become a bit of a kind of calendar event for me. Like, it comes around again, and I come, and it's a chance for me to think about what's happened in the previous year, because it's once a year, and it's kind of far outside of my normal cycle of things, you know? It's like, I don't spend a ton of time in Scandinavia right now, so it's like, oh, it must have been a year. Although, hopefully, I'm going to be back a lot more this year with blockchainers. So, what has happened in the last year? Does anybody remember what the Ether price was a year ago? What was it, $5? Something like that? 15? Yeah, that's a little more recent, right? So, since the last time I was here, we went through the Titanic price explosion, right? The price went nuts, the media went nuts, everybody started acting crazy, and for a brief moment, it seemed like we had finally invented the financial system which only ever went up, which, needless to say, made everybody extremely enthusiastic until they realized that there is no such animal, and volatility does what volatility does, the price comes back down again, everybody freaks out. Oh my God, how could this possibly happen to us? So, what we have established is that there is $500 billion worth of interest in seeing cryptocurrencies happen. Right? Now, I say specifically cryptocurrencies rather than the blockchain or Bitcoin or even ICOs, because to all intents and purposes, all of the money in that bubble was being used as currency. The total actual real trade transactional volume represented by the underlying instruments is a rounding error. Right? We're still in a position where we're not doing real trade on the blockchain in any kind of real volume, but what we have created is a very exciting new asset class. How do we close the gap, right? We have this kind of huge foreign exchange bubble of people running money in and out of these weird-looking currencies. We have a whole bunch of dot-coms that have essentially 20-year burn rates. And I now say that, a successful ICO is the modern equivalent of getting tenure at university, right? You can do whatever you like in terms of basic research for the next 20 years. Maybe we needed a new tenure system, but I'm not sure we're selecting the right people for that tenure. How do we get into the real world, right? How do we get into a position where all of these very nice potentialities that we have go from being potentialities to actualities? I used to say, when I was a kid, every potential implies an equal and opposite invisible barrier, because otherwise it wouldn't be potential, it would be reality. So what are the things that are preventing us actually getting the thing to work? Now, some of this is the scaling problem, right? Too few transactions, too expensive. Some of it is volatility. We don't really have stable coins that are stable enough to do stablecoin stuff properly. So there's a whole bunch of stability associated issues. But above all other things, I think the fundamental problem is we don't have invoices. Right? I mean, if you can have blockchain invoices, I will pay you the following amount in 60 days if you do the following services for me now. I think just getting invoices right is probably worth quite a lot. Because, how often do you guys generate invoices? Raise your hand if you generate at least one invoice a month. Right? How often do those invoices not work properly? They get lost, the person doesn't pay, there's some haggling about whether the invoice was correct, yada, 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 yada. Right? Raise your hands if you have one experience in the last 12 months of an invoice that blew out. Yeah. And probably it took hours to days to fix. Right? Plus it imposes all kind of volatility. And that's largely just individuals. Right? If you're part of some large company that does a whole bunch of supply chain stuff and you're generating, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of invoices a year, as would be typical for something like Boeing, they have entire departments that are dedicated to fixing invoices. Right? Now, I was taught this model by Scott Nelson of Sweetbridge because Scott Nelson comes out of the invoice business. He used to be part of a company, he used to lead a company that managed something on the order of $7 billion of invoicing a year, and they were lending against invoices. They had the whole complicated thing. But he's more or less the philosopher of invoices. And what he tells you very clearly is invoices are what make the world go round. The B2B invoice world is $45 trillion a year. The B2C e-commerce world is about $1 trillion a year. So there's this universe next door of business-to-business transactions that the internet has not yet managed to transform, and it's a $45 trillion a year bucket. And you sort of think, so if the failure rate for invoices is about 5%, 5% of 45 trillion gets hitched up somewhere in the invoicing process. So that's on the order of $1 trillion a year of absolute hitch, right? $2 trillion a year, right? $2 trillion a year of things that go wrong. And you think about, well, we really need a use case for the blockchain that actually does something useful. Just getting B2B invoicing to not be broken arguably totally justifies the entire size of the Bitcoin blockchain ERC20 token ICO bubble. Right? And we've seen systemic transformation on this size before, right? I mean, the good old-fashioned sea container, you had this golden age of industrial manufacturing just after World War II, when you had these massive militarized factories that flipped over to civilian production. And then we started putting the output of those factories in big metal boxes and shipping them around. Container shipping is said to have been responsible for a 7% increase in global GDP. And that begins to sound like real money, right? Global GDP is on the order of 100 trillion a year. So you think 2 or 3% of 100 trillion a year sounds like $2 or $3 trillion. Yeah, we could totally use that, right? And if you've got a bunch of assets that save some substantial fraction of $3 trillion a year, those assets would be worth about 10 times the amount of the money that they saved. And pretty soon you put A over B, and you begin to get some rather large numbers. And these are the sorts of rather large numbers that are thrown around in the blockchain space when people say things like, $100,000 Bitcoin, right? But when they say $100,000 Bitcoin, they don't really have any economic rationale for 100,000 Bitcoin. What they're really talking about when they say $100,000 Bitcoin is it's a measurement of mass hysteria, right? It's a thermometer for mass hysteria. Right? And Bitcoin is a thermometer for mass hysteria. I mean, that's a harsh way of looking at it. But at the end of the day, until you begin to see enormous volumes of transactions for goods and services paid for in Bitcoin, what is Bitcoin for? Was this not meant to be a payment rail? Right? And obviously there's a lot of arguments about, no, we never meant it to be a payment rail. It was always supposed to be cheese. But fundamentally, it was meant to be a thing for making payments with, and we're not really making payments with it, because nobody's able to. And there's the money laundering problems, and there are endless reasons why it hasn't succeeded in the payment system. So we're in a position where the revolution is basically running up a hill, right, without a clear agenda for where it's going. And I am, incredibly grateful to Scott Nelson to really explaining to us this entire way of seeing the blockchain space. This is entirely the Sweetbridge model. Scott does this much better than I do. But I'm going to riff off this as a starting point in a minute, and I'm going to talk a little bit about systems transformation. Right? So this is the kind of invoice-centric story of the future of the blockchain. We just fix business-to-business invoicing, and it liberates trillions of dollars a year. Now, for the people in the audience who are technologists, does the technology for that transformation sound all that bad? Right? Raise your hand if it sounds like the kind of thing you could probably get done. Right? If we all work together, could we get business-to-business invoicing sorted out? Sounds pretty good to me, right? It doesn't involve artificial intelligence. It doesn't involve the sudden creation of a blockchain that does 100 million transactions a second. Maybe bits of it go over Plasma or Lightning networks. Maybe bits of it go over main chain. Maybe you've got some permission ledgers. But you sort of look at that and you're just like, business invoicing is totally a thing we could be doing. Now, here's the question. Why aren't we? And the answer is because it's really, really dull. Right? What got people interested in the blockchain was basically a kind of flying car Reagan Gothic model of the future. They wanted to be in a world where there was a single global system that was fair, that was equitable, that worked, that made everybody rich, that paid for the development of rocket ships, cured cancer, and implemented an age of peace, prosperity, and reason. right? And that vision is an essentially political vision, and it's a utopian political vision. And it was never exactly clear how Bitcoin and decentralization led us to that political vision, but it definitely felt like it should, right? And surely, if we've got seamless end-to-end payments across the entire world, well, then there'll be no need for governments, right? And everybody's like, yeah, wait, what did he just say? But we never really got very far into that critique because it was a machine that just printed money for flim-flam, right? Fast-talking nonsense, as long as it was tightly connected to that utopian vision, came off as being, you're telling us about the future of humanity, and lots of people that were inherently unrealistic and utopian shoveled their money into the furnace, right? It's a bit like 419 scams, where they're intentionally filled with spelling errors and ridiculous scenarios because they preferentially want to filter for idiots, right? What we've done is we've basically skimmed an enormous amount of wealth from the portion of humanity that are fundamentally discontent with the world as it is and utopian, right? We've got a $300 billion bucket of utopian money, and they're financing utopian thinking. Now, that is a great way to start a revolution, because revolutions are made when people do things which are irrational inside of the existing system and make them work. And revolutions usually stall on money and power. And 300 billion, whatever the bubble is currently at, this is enough money to pay for essentially infinite engineering. Right. The largest government IT projects of the kind that just notoriously pancake into the ground without anybody ever getting fired are sort of $4 billion projects. We could do 75 of those before the blockchain ecosystem ran out of money. Right. So we've got infinite engineers and infinite money. And if you can't turn infinite engineers and infinite money into a decent amount of political power in a time like this, in a world like this, something is wrong, right? But what we've lacked is a sort of practical political vision for how we turn infinite money and infinite engineers into infinite power and then infinite change. And God help all of us, I'm going to try and fill in some of the gaps in that story. So the first thing is the question of political loyalty. Right? You guys live in a highly functional, if somewhat dull state that is more or less entirely funded by oil money. You're like the Saudi Arabia of socialism. And, it turns out that life is pretty good in the Saudi Arabia of socialism, because the problem with socialism is that your welfare state runs out of money, and that's not going to happen anytime soon. You just get the shovel. It's going to be great, right? So the Saudi Arabia of socialism is a hard place to think about the rest of the world from, right? It's very, very hard to get a clearer conception of just how crap things are, even in other countries that are notionally peers, right? The UK is crumbling, right? And, it goes through phases where it kind of falls apart, and then it pulls itself together, and it falls apart, and it pulls itself together. It's kind of just our way of doing things. A couple of generations of life is hard, a couple of generations of life is good, but right now it's falling to pieces. All my young friends are depressed. It's terrible. America, they have an opiate epidemic which is doing the same kind of damage to their culture as alcohol did in the collapsing Soviet Union. That's how bad it is. All those stories you have about how terrible things were in the collapsing Soviet Union, America looks like that today. And that's not because everything is fine, right? So you're in a world which is genuinely distressed with very serious problems at a very large scale in places that you sort of think of as being peers, where things must be about the same as they are here, but in fact things are horrendously worse, much more poorly organized, and they're constantly having to choose between education and health. Education, health, taxes, they're constantly trapped in that pyramid. In America, they also have huge military spending to support. So it's the rest of the world that has the need for revolutionary change, right? It's not here, it's not Switzerland, it's not really New York, it's not London, right? It's the north of England, it's rural America, it's the poorer countries in Europe, right? These are the places where things really don't work, and you can't just paper over the cracks with cash. So In those places, you have typically huge problems getting things to happen because you can't get access to capital. But the world is filled with enormous amounts of capital that are desperate for high rates of return. And if your programmers live in Spain, you could pay them a fifth of what you pay those same guys if they were living in San Francisco and paying $4,000 a month for a studio apartment. What we lack is the infrastructure for targeting capital from wealthy areas to poor areas. And that's not being done as charity, it's being done because the capital is vastly more efficient when it's spent in poor regions than it's spent in rich regions. The worst place to spend venture capital money is rich countries. And we do it because there's sort of an assumption that, well, that's where the talent is and so on and henceforth. But actually, if you're talking about a genuinely globalized trade environment, there has to be some mechanism for taking talent in poor nations or poor parts of wealthy nations and directly capitalizing that talent. If only we had some way of moving money around the world in exchange for things like equity and profit shares. If only we had some kind of technological solution to this problem. Has anybody heard about anything like that? Right? So, the first thing that I would suggest in terms of breakthrough efficiency gains is that we need to get serious about a global blockchain investment ecosystem that targets capital spend in poor countries that are developing their own tech hubs. And this is a strategy, right? This is not about taking the existing systems that we've got and continuing to run those systems. This is about changing the positioning of the entire blockchain movement into a piece of critical global economic infrastructure. Right? Because if we are not critical global economic infrastructure by the time the Americans elect a new president, we are in super deep trouble. Because as soon as the White House cleans house, they're coming for us. Obama made it very clear in 2016 when he spoke at South by Southwest that ordinary Americans could not be allowed to run around with a Swiss bank account in their pocket because eventually it was going to make things like tax collection difficult. And when words like that come out of the mouth of the President of the United States, typically you've got about 2 years warning for the smart money to get out before the boot comes down. And we've had an enormous postponement on that happening, as happened with, for example, internet gambling. We've had a long postponement of that because the Americans are currently busy taking care of their own problems at home. Right? But in all probability, once they get over the current difficulties, right, they're going to go back to doing the stuff they always did, and that is policing globally, and we are well up there on the list of targets. It's very, very important to understand we have a limited window to become indispensable to the world, and if we miss that limited window, we're going to wind up basically in the same position as junk bond dealers did in the 1980s. If we haven't solved problems at a global scale that nobody other than us can solve, we do not get a seat at the big table. Because if we're not solving a problem that somebody else cannot solve, we are not fundamentally critical, and we can be replaced or we can get nuked. We have a responsibility to make ourselves useful, and right now we are not discharging that responsibility. We've got an enormous pool of utopian money, but we're not actually taking utopian action, right? We need to get right down to the basics of how do we make this thing work, because if we don't do that, the other competing forces in global society are going to extend their regulatory power and they're going to give us a seriously hard time. Right? We have to get real about this. So that's the first kind of mission item, right? Oh, it slipped. Sorry, I didn't realize. Is that better? Yeah. Right. So, right, that is the first mission item. We have to get into a position where we're really solving global problems properly, because if we don't do that, we are not going to get the kind of mandates that we want to continue to operate in the way that we have been. It is very important that we get into a position where if there is harsh regulatory action, there are bad real-world consequences. And right now, that's just not true. If you turned off the entire blockchain ecosystem tomorrow morning, how many people other than the token holders would be inconvenienced? Paper wealth would disappear, actual trade would be almost uninfluenced. And this is a position of astonishing vulnerability. We must close the gap between the utopian vision and the practical reality. Really, we've got about 2 years. And if we don't get it done, there is going to be literally hell to pay. So, first agenda item is global investment in venture capital style funding of enterprises in poor countries. Because the talent is cheap, the blockchain takes care of most of the property rights stuff which is necessary to make those investments work through things like token economics. It is vastly easier on the regulatory front because you've got some way of managing this which doesn't involve ownership of the companies from outside, only ownership of the tokens. There is a real need for a piece of work on how you do something which is a stable, secure, technically sufficient platform for running VC in poor countries. And we could do this. This is not even hard. Probably a whole bunch of the ICOs which have been successful are already running on that template, but we haven't given it a clear name. We haven't done the necessary legal work to tighten up the models. We haven't made it into a part of the blockchain brand. Oh, the blockchain, that thing that runs the 50 innovation centers in poor countries that are just spitting out amazing startups. Yeah, that. Right? The decentralized global Silicon Valley is a thing that we have the capital resources to fund into existence. We need to understand that it's part of our survival plan. It's super critical we do this. So, how am I doing for time, by the way? Come on. Great, God, that's amazing. Right, so second thing. The second thing that we ought to be seriously looking at is trade and logistics. Again, 45 trillion a year. It's an enormous global market. Is anybody actually involved in logistics or trade? Right? How broken is the paperwork? Broken. Yeah, there's a lot of right? Yeah, and somebody told me that the majority of those paperwork systems haven't changed since the 17th century. Right? That they go back to the first early stirrings of globalization, in the age of empires, and they haven't really been updated since. I'm not going to talk about that in any particular detail because there is a near infinite amount of looking at trade and logistics on blockchains. There are lots of people looking at it, but you have to think of this in terms of being strategic economic priorities for the space, right? Priority one, we need to take huge steps in the innovation economy, and we need to globalize the innovation economy because it makes the capital go way further. Right? Step two, or in parallel, but the second thing we need to be working on is actually closing the deals on trade and logistics, specifically trade facilitation. Right? How do we use the blockchain to remove what they call non-tariff barriers, all the paperwork and all of the financial obstacles from getting things shipped around the world or commissioned in other countries? How do we pull out all of the roadblocks so that the only thing that you do is do your transactions on the blockchain and pay your taxes when the container hits port? Right? And if we can begin to build that out again as we're from the blockchain, this is what we do, we begin to change the public perception of the space from basically Wall Street in the 1980s but running on Red Bull rather than cocaine to something that has actual social utility. Right, sorry, I seem to have broken someone. But that is how the world sees us, right? A bunch of hipster nerds, right, who are pulling money from nowhere, and they're not even spending it on flash cars, right? I met a bunch of people at a recent event who were driving around in the most ridiculous collection of flash cars. They were crazy, man. And it turns out they were all serious finance people that had just moved into the blockchain space early, and they were treating the whole thing just like it was the finance space. They had all the kind of surface of the finance space, whereas the major majority of the serious power holders in the blockchain world show up in ragged sneakers and a t-shirt because it shows that they kept all their money in tokens. Right? It's the austerity of the blockchain monastic elite. No, we keep everything in Bitcoin because it is still underpriced. Right? But we can't get a seat at the global table with that interface. Right? I mean, you can only go so far in a negotiation with the established powers that still run the world, and that's not changing anytime soon, if your negotiators turn up in sneakers. Right? And this brings us to the third thing, which is identity. So, blockchain identity, high hopes, right? There are probably 10 or 15 people in this room that are working on blockchain identity stuff. What does it even mean? Right? I wrote a piece a couple of years ago called Tell Me Who You Are, which is basically a systematic deconstruction of the idea of identity. I run a thing called the Identity Insurance Consortium, which serves to basically build insurance policies that cover the gaps in whatever identity infrastructure is being deployed, so that if the identity system fails to identify somebody because they put a fake name into the system, you have insurance to cover the gaps. All of those things are going to take us into a world where we might actually get a global identity system that works. Now, can anybody tell me what you can do if you have a global identity system that you cannot do without one? What is the one single correct use for a comprehensive global identity system? I will take 2 guesses from the audience. Take a guess. You, sir.
Helping refugees.
Helping refugees? Yeah. Taxation. Very good, right? So my suggestion is let's have a vote for who should run the world. Right? If democracy is so great, let's have a global democracy. Right? And this is a simple proposal. If democracy is so fantastic, let's have one. Now, China might win, right? But, if we are serious about democratic principles, why are we only having democracy in these funny-looking postage stamp corners we call countries? If democracy is the correct way for things to be governed, let's have a global democracy, right? Who is more likely to get something done about climate change? A consortium of 200 nation states that goes back to the age when we thought that the purpose of that consortium was to stop wars between member states, that has almost no ability to meaningfully address global problems because it has no ability to make law and pass law that is then imposed on the nation states. It can only negotiate treaties that, generally speaking, people can ignore with impunity. That's the UN, right? Or a globally constituted democratic body, right? That says, we are in charge of running the world and we're going to take care of the problems which are above the level of the nation state to operate. Come on, we're from the internet, right? Why shouldn't we begin to build global government to go with global communication? Why is that not our manifest destiny? We are the real globalists. We had industrial age globalization that was managed by treaty. Post-industrial globalization, it's governed by network, right? We are the point of the spear of post-industrial globalization. Why then should we not be directly getting involved in global governance? Right? Now you think, how do we build a voter roll of 7 billion people? Surely this is difficult and expensive. You don't need 7 billion people, right? In most instances, you don't need more than about 25,000. The trick is, you have to be able to randomly select them, right? Now, imagine that we've got 5 or 10 million people enrolled in global blockchain identity schemes, and we know enough about these people to have some idea of how old they are, where they live, maybe something about their lifestyle, right? Out of that group, we can randomly select a single individual human being, right? If we were going to use the mobile phones rather than the blockchain, we could randomly pick a random phone somewhere in the world and we could phone it. We could basically just make up phone numbers and dial them until somebody picked up. It doesn't really matter how you pick your random human being, but you pick a random human being and you ask them, hey, could we ask you a question? And if they say yes, you ask them some questions. Do you think it should be legal for people to ship, live cows at sea? Yes or no? I don't know, I've never seen a cow. But, if we were to ask, here are some facts about the issue, okay, yes, no, boom, they make their choice, right? Do you think that global warming is a terrible thing? And if so, how much more tax would you be willing to pay to do something comprehensive about getting your country to zero emissions in 15 years? I don't know, what are my options, right? So, one individual doesn't really tell you anything, right? 1,000 individuals, you begin to understand that there's some sort of global split on this, but what you can't tell is the statistical significance of the 1,000 people that you've picked. Because although they're random from a self-selected group. They're random from the people who have phones, or they're random from the people that have a blockchain identity. So the second thing you need is to take this primary data about what people want, and you take the primary data and you feed it through a statistical model that estimates significance. So we say, right, we've got 25,000 people's opinions on the following 16 issues. Here's all the information we've got about who they are and where they live. You take that down to the university geography department and say, based on this sample, tell us what the world thinks. And they say, well, you've got 17 calls in Bangladesh, and each one of those calls is basically standing in for, whatever it would be, 11 million people. Fantastic, right? And here, you've got 71 calls in Manhattan, and each one of those calls is going to stand in for 1/10 of a person, right? And you just weight the model relative to what we know about global population and global demographics to make an estimate of what global public opinion is. Now, somebody comes back and says, well, I've got a different model, and in my model, it ought to be this. And a third person comes up with their model and says, my model turns out to be like that. And at this point, we can make some predictions. Each one of those groups makes a prediction about how the model will work, and then you can go and you can make another 1,500 phone calls specifically in Bangladesh to figure out what's going on. You can target additional phone research or additional blockchain messaging-based research to true up the statistical models with reality to any desired level of accuracy. Right. So on an issue where the world is 92% one way, you only need a little bit of money to do a survey to be damn sure that it's somewhere in the 80s or 90s. If the issue is closer to 50-50, maybe closer than 50-50 is all you need to know to say we don't really have a mandate. Right? But in any instance where there's doubt, you make more phone calls, you do more blockchain-based research, you'll log everything on chain so there's no accusation of fraud, and you can build the case for a statistically significant model of global public opinion at totally affordable prices. What are we talking about? 25 cents a call? 10 cents a call? Do it by voice over IP? Do large-scale community translation so that you can ask people in their local languages? There is a piece of global infrastructure waiting to be built there that's of an approximately the same complexity as Wikipedia, but at the end of that, what we get is the beginnings of global governance. Governance by the people and for the people, not intermediated by the nation state and not intermediated by corporations. And no technology other than blockchain can give this to us. Does that sound like a thing we want? No. I thought you believed in democracy. You don't believe in democracy? Oh dear. No, you want democracy inside of your postage stamp, but you don't want global democracy?
No, I think a body of people should govern themselves, and that people living in different places in the world have a different heritage, and they should preserve that. And there's a Gemeinschaft that is different from one place in the world to another place in the world. And if you want to have a decentralized world, you need to take that into account. And you won't do that in the way you proposed.
Well, interesting, right? But at the end of the day, if you believe in borders, you don't want a decentralized world.
You want to decentralize between borders.
Decentralized between borders. So we keep the nation state. So what then is it that we're decentralizing again? At that point, you might as well have one permission blockchain per country run by your government. That will solve all the problems that you're interested in solving. And I'm not against nationalistic blockchain adoption, but if you want global systems, you've got to build global systems.
But does it have to be political?
Frankly, if we don't get carbon under control, it's going to break the world in really horrific ways, and the UN's had 30 years of trying and has gotten us nowhere.
Isn't that the scam? Isn't that the scam?
Global warming is a scam? What bridge did they find you guys under? Right? I mean, I knew this was troll country, but this is really saying something. Maybe. I'm going to go with the science on this one. So, right? We have the potential to build these systems, right? System number one, we do something comprehensive about invoicing and all the rest of that stuff, right? System number two, we do something comprehensive about trade. System number three, global democracy. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that this has the ability to puncture holes in your nation states and give people orders, but the ability to know what global public opinion is in a statistically significant way gives us the foundations necessary for building global governance. And without global governance, we are in real trouble because the nation states have been slobbering all over the global warming problem for decades and have yet to bite it. right? We have huge problems that this nation state is just the wrong shape to fix. It's like if you tried to do national borders in Norway with a consortium of mayors. The mayors just don't own the perimeter of the country, and it doesn't matter what the mayors say, you can't get your perimeter sorted out. It just doesn't work. You need a political unit which is the right shape to do the governance. The only political unit that we have that is genuinely global is the internet. That is the place that we have to derive global governance from, and we need to get seriously organized to do that. Now, this brings me to the fourth big priority for the blockchain. Let's go to Mars. Right? The dot-com world, right? The dot-com world paid for basically all of the really interesting stuff which is happening in space these days. And it's not just Elon Musk, right? There are lots and lots of people with private space programs that came out of that whole show, Bezos notably, right? And they're doing vastly better work in terms of the large-scale ambitious push into space than we're currently seeing from the nation-state level space agencies. So what is it going to take, right, to get this thing done? And the answer is an ICO. Is William still here, or is William gone? No, I think he's gone. So I think he had to take a plane. It's a shame he's not here because this is absolutely his thing, right? What is it going to take to ICO the Mars mission? Well, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to figure out some property rights that you can sell to the token holders. We're going to have to figure out what the asset is that's being sold. Now, I think there are two fairly easy to imagine assets. The first is stuff on Mars, and whether that's air tokens, or whether that's land rights, or whether that's the ability to run some set of monopolies in Mars, right? There's stuff on Mars, and all of that is difficult to imagine, and we don't really know how Mars will be governed, and those tokens may never be enforceable. You know, what if there are jurisdictional issues? But on the other side of this, there's stuff on the ground, right? And the stuff on the ground that I think would be worth potentially auctioning off in some kind of ICO-like mechanism is the patent portfolio that will be created by the Mars mission. Because the moonshots gave us, you know, a few useful bits of technology like the microprocessor, and who knows what's going to be invented on the way to Mars, right? If they hit something building out all the technology you need to run a Mars base that is of as much significance as the microprocessor, and token holders in that ICO have some kind of economic rights in the growth that comes out of that patent portfolio, you begin to talk about potentially one of the most exciting commodities on Earth for people to own if they're interested in long-term economic gain. Right? Plus, it's cool. Right? So, if Elon Musk was to turn the magic handle on this and set up an ICO for Mars with a bunch of carefully designed property rights, how much do you think they could raise? Right? 20, 30 billion dollars? I mean, if Telegram could raise 2, right? Do you reckon it's possible to raise a kind of 20 billion, 30 billion dollar ICO? 10% of all the assets in the blockchain space go to Elon Musk's Mars mission? That sounds fairly credible, right? I mean, I think it could be twice that, right? And that much money with relatively little in the way of strings attached, this is how you turn Elon Musk into the actual Tony Stark, right? I mean, you know what would happen, right? Because all of a sudden they've got an enormous amount of capital and they've got the loyalty of the entire utopian finance pool. Everybody that wanted to see radical change, you know, they wanted it so much, and the only place they could throw the money was Bitcoin. Well, if you really want utopian radical change in the world, and you can also get a Mars mission out of it, of course there would be a migration of capital towards that kind of an agenda. So I think that there is an enormous possibility for us to get right on top of that, again, as a culture, as a collective, as a community, start laying the track. Right? Tell people it's coming, because it's certainly coming. We don't know anything about how, we don't know anything about the form. I'm not in communication with SpaceX. I'm just doing my part and telling people it's obviously going to happen. And if everybody is ready for it when it comes, it will go a lot easier. Right? So this is my disruptive agenda for the blockchain. Let's actually get into the real world in a really profound way. Let's take responsibility for solving a bunch of problems that no other entity is capable of solving. Let's stop mucking around with things that look like .coms. Global infrastructure that cannot be done by anybody else, that's our turf. Our job is to own the future, to go and take the responsibility for funding and building the critical assets of a globalized humanity. Why else did we build this stuff? To build another generation of .coms that are massively overfunded and that solve important problems like cheese rental? Right? You can rent cheese out of a database. You don't need that. Right? If the problem has already been solved, we don't really just need a blockchain version of that. We need to start accepting that the global order is fundamentally broken. The nation state has failed to deliver. It's leaving enormous amounts of things which really need to get fixed, unfixed. And we, as the people that have become part of this utopian movement, need to get serious about delivering the utopia that these people put their money behind. Can we deliver utopia? Right? Well, I don't know, can we, right? You've got lots of identity projects, but I don't see anybody working on the global democracy. You've got lots of supply chain projects, but I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get a single global system or it's going to be a bunch of point-by-point optimizations. We've got tons and tons and tons of people who are talking about currencies and things like asset-backing currencies, but does any of that turn into a global comprehensive approach to manage things like carbon, right? We've got all of the toolkits, but we seem to be missing the political will to apply those toolkits to the big problems. And for that, I think we need cultural change inside of the blockchain space where we basically stop looking at token values every 35 seconds and go back to saying, okay, so the Bitcoin political vision was a single global currency, let's build single global everything else's. Maybe they turn out to be multiple. Maybe you build one and it breaks into 15 competing units and the whole thing is super efficient. I don't mind whether it's individual systems, cartels, cooperatives, competition. I don't mind what the models are, as long as we get global service provision in all of these critical areas that right now we are not managing. So does that basically make sense as a manifesto? Right. So I peeled off a tiny part of this entire problem and I built a company around it. Right? The company is called Mattereum, and the basic idea is Ethereum manages the kind of ethereal stuff, the stuff while it's all basically safely locked in cyberspace. Mattereum provides you with the material interface to take that world and use it to manage actual legal property. And it's more or less entirely lawyers. Does that sound like fun? Dull, right? But unless somebody does that rather dull, rather complicated job, you have this kind of ethereal world up here, and it just can't get hold of physical assets. There's just no way of getting the smart contract to lock onto an object, so you can move the ownership of the object using the smart contract. And the ability to change the legal status of physical goods in the real world using smart contracts is a critical part of building out this bridge to the future. The bridge to the future has enormous amounts of trouble getting assets into the future, right? Just pulling assets out of the paper ledgers, out of the audited systems, out of the existing sort of one company at a time payment mechanisms. It's very hard to pry the assets out and move them into the blockchain space. Once they're there, there's an enormous plethora of services and technique and ideas and technology and companies and all the rest of this stuff. But until you've got an actual controllable asset, it's almost impossible to make those systems work. So I went back and did the very dull, very delicate watchmaking job of figuring out how we get control of physical assets. And we've got a bunch of very interesting clients who are doing that. And if you guys are interested, come and talk to me about it. So we did the simple thing, right? Then we handed it to the PR team, and then the PR team made it exciting again. It's very clever. So I'm going to show you, just to wind up, the video that my PR team made that we're very proud of, that makes all of the dull legal stuff that we do to get hold of assets look exciting. Right, let's see if this thing works. It's only about a minute and a half long.
What would business on the blockchain look like? Smart contracts open up a vast new space for automation, not just for money and digital assets, but also physical assets, intellectual property, and services. The potential market is huge. But how do you connect code with physical assets? What happens when there's a bug or when real-world circumstances change in ways we didn't expect? To put business on the blockchain, we need the right legal and technical foundations to support it. This is what Mattereum provides with its platform for decentralized commercial law.
Whoa.
It's just Wi-Fi.
Oh no. What's happening? Make it start again. Oh dear. Buffering problems. So that
Commercial law. By combining smart contract code with the necessary legal terms, business can be automated while ensuring the correct interpretation of everyone's obligations when something goes wrong. Take a container of goods sailing from China to Europe. A smart contract records its movement from factory to shipping agent to customs officer to warehouse, automatically generating relevant documents and paying fees and taxes. But if something goes wrong along the way, the shipment is delayed or the goods are not what was expected, that's where you'll be glad the contract was built on Mattereum. With decentralized dispute resolution, claims big and small can be resolved fairly and efficiently by independent, technically competent arbitrators, and national courts can enforce their decisions wherever the businesses and assets are located, in more than 150 countries. With Mattereum, commercial agreements can be made with confidence, combining the efficiency of automated smart contracts with the reliability of international arbitration. That's business on the blockchain.
Now, right, what's actually happening in there is a bunch of very precise, very delicate, very dull legal work, right? You need interfaces to things like identity systems. We're not building an identity system, we're relying on the existing commercial infrastructure. You need arbitrators. We're not building our own arbitrators, we're taking existing arbitrators with decades of experience in technical law, and we're providing them with whatever training and support they need to become fully fluent in blockchain arbitration. Right? We're not going out there and building tagging systems for sea containers because a bunch of that stuff is already done. We're focusing on a single problem, which is the enforceability of smart contracts as legal contracts. And that is largely a legal process with a whole bunch of very, very careful engineering of smart contracts and a bunch of co-design between the smart contracts, the business processes, and the legal systems. To make these things fully airtight globally requires an enormous amount of legal analysis. It's going to cost us a truly staggering amount of money. We're going to get to that as soon as we figure out where the SEC is at and what the SEC is doing. Right? We don't really want to run ahead of the regulation on this stuff, but once we get a regulatory framework that we trust, probably all systems will be go. All of that stuff is embedded inside of the global vision, right? If we don't get the blockchain as an anchor off which a huge amount of global trade hangs, we are not going to be in a position to negotiate if the Americans change their mind about crypto. And you know that the American government has generally been against everything that people like us are for about 50 years. Right? So our job is to get solidly bolted into the real world to the point where it is very, very difficult to disentangle the blockchain from trade. And once that's done, if there is a much stronger regulatory pushback on crypto than we've seen so far, it becomes a case of regulating the systems in such a way as they continue to support global trade, but maybe lose some of the more exciting possibilities until the regulators had a little more time to get used to them. This is a real-world fallback strategy, because I've seen many rounds of the technical revolution where people thought we were going to go all the way this time and the whole world was going to change, but the incumbents are amazingly durable. They hang on and they hang on and they hang on and they hang on, and the thing about the utopian is that the utopian is literally no place. The utopian thing has never fully succeeded, but in every round of utopian enthusiasm, we get to change the real world another 5 or another 10%. So in a lot of ways, What I'm looking at this is laying the foundations for the salvage operation post-bubble. And this is a very harsh way of looking at this stuff, but I'm a realist, right? I'm a citizen of the real world, the reality-based community, right? We are going to get into a position where we have to have a settlement between us and the nation state. In an age when we have things like Zcash, it's very hard to argue that blockchain is automatically something which is compatible with rule of law. Because if you've got fully anonymous transactions using snarks, it's very hard to imagine any kind of fundamental reconciliation between things like money laundering regulation and the blockchain. It's just about imaginable on Bitcoin. It's not imaginable once the snarks are in play. So we know that there's going to be a point where a compromise is reached. If at that point of compromise, we are supporting a 5% of global trade, then we're in a strong enough negotiating position that we can say, look, if you ban these systems, all of these companies will be harmed, please don't do that. If at that point all we have is an enormous speculative bubble with tokens, with meta tokens and meta tokens all stacked on top of each other and a whole bunch of weird looking instruments and no product, we're going to get wiped out, right? We have to be of genuine utility to humanity as a whole in clearly demonstrable ways, or we don't get a seat at the table. So that's my mission, right? For the next year, I would like all of you to really try and push as hard as you can on getting this stuff into the real world and getting real adoption fostered. Not because it's good for you personally, not because it's good for your companies, it will be both, right? But because it's how we preserve as much of the utopian vision that started this whole process 10 years ago as is possible when we get to the final reconciliation between utopia and realism at the point of a regulator's sword. Thank you.
I think we have time for a couple of quick questions, if we have any.
You touched on global democracy, and there was kind of a controversy around that. But couldn't we also fix like more local democracies? Wouldn't
Sure.
that be
I mean, you could fix
part of
local democracy as much as you like, but local democracy in nice countries already works pretty well, right? I mean, you can improve it, sure, but there's an enormous gap at the global level. The local levels, it's incremental improvement. The global level, it's going from nothing to something.
Cool. Okay, if we don't have any further questions.
There was one back over here.
Where?
Would it be a halfway decent idea to try and get crypto into something like ERP systems?
Yes, I think ERP is absolutely where it's at. Enterprise resource planning. So this is systems like SAP, Oracle. I'm sure that the ERP vendors are working very hard on crypto, but they'll be looking at it largely as one company has an ERP system and somehow crypto is used internally. What we really need is a kind of ERP that works like email, right? The way that your email messages are routed across any number of different computers and they go from, you've got these kind of store and forward systems that are dotted around. We really need ERPs that work not inside of a single company, but across many companies in a seamless global integration. And those kind of systems will have to be bolted to things like SAP inside of companies, but then have these kind of global gateways where you go out into this much larger internet environment. I wish I knew more about ERP, because I'm absolutely convinced that the ERPization, so what self-sovereign identity does for individuals, the right kind of adoption of ERP on blockchain does for objects. ERP is how you get individual identifiers for objects so that you can track them as they make their way across the global trade matrix. So yeah, I think ERP is hugely important. If you're working on it, come talk to me afterwards, tell me what you're doing.
My question is, how do you see my data movement, the cradle to grave blockchain, in conjunction with your idea of global democracy?
I didn't understand the first part of the question.
I mean, you see, there is a huge movement called My Data movement, right?
Right. Right.
And,
So this
and
is
you
the-
touched it.
Right. So this is the idea that people have these kind of data wallets. They own their own data.
Exactly.
Yeah. Everybody seems to be in favor of that. The governments are in favor of it because they're terrified of having enormous silos which will get hacked. Google is in favor of it because they think everybody's just going to wind up using Google for their data wallets. Individual civil liberties folks are in favor of it because they think it gives them the full future of freedom. I'm pretty sure it's where we're going. I'm not sure we'll like it when we get there, because if that turns out to be like Google wound up basically owning email because they made a better email system than anybody else. If Google winds up making the best data wallet, we just wind up with a mass migration of personal data into Google, or maybe it'll be Facebook, or maybe it'll be a new monopoly. So if it's going to happen, we have to fight very hard to make sure that that's an ecological system with lots of different players in it. Or you need some kind of totally dominant solution which is 100% open source software and hardware. Because anything else will eventually wind up with the data locker being owned by the people that already own all of your other personal data, and then who will be happy?
I really like your idea about completely decentralized decision making on a global scale. And we tried to offer the Ministry of Climate a carbon reduction project on the individual level globally for 9 billion people.
Mm-hmm.
But this was very against their policy with the UN framework.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see working with governments when they really don't want this, they are scared of it?
Well, I mean, what I'm really discussing is an opinion polling system, right? It's just a way of knowing what the world really thinks in some statistically justifiable way. It's hard to imagine anybody being really intimidated by that, even if it is the first step towards a global government. So one of the tricky things about democracy is everybody is focused on the machinery of democracy in terms of what an individual does. But I think some of the most effective shifts in the future of democracy have been shifts about what is the boundary of the democracy. So, giving increasing power over quality of life issues to cities is a huge step forward in democracy. Taking a whole bunch of rights away from the American states and locking them at the federal level in Washington, D.C. is a step backwards for democracy. In general, figuring out who gets to vote on what is at least as important as figuring out how they vote and when they vote and who does the voting. So I am very much in favor of democracies at scales. So I think, for example, if you think of the European power grid, you can imagine that in theory, everybody that was connected to the European power grid could get to vote on governance issues at the European power grid level. But if you're off-grid in some village in the far north of Finland, where they just run the entire thing on solar panel and diesel generators, you're not connected to the grid doesn't affect you, you don't get to vote on that. Even if you're inside of the geographical territory, you're not personally affected. So democratic structures where the people that are personally affected are the decision makers, that scales down to things like bus routes. Right? You get to vote that the buses will run, through a different part of town because they're totally missing some new thing that's just been built. We need to change the bus route, people vote, you change the bus route. I'm very in favor of this small-scale democracy, but I think that the geographical region is the wrong structure for most democracies. You want a much more careful indexing of who the affected parties are, and the notion that you have this somewhat fractal quality to that democracy is a really good fit for what blockchain enables. Getting the nation states to play along, some countries will come easily, some countries will come slowly. We got one more up here.
Hello. The decentralized voting system. Looking at global votes, or even in a country, you could only see a percentage of people who actually vote.
A very small percentage.
Right?
Yeah.
And in general human behavior, you have the innovators, you have the early adopters, then you have the masses and so forth.
So this is why it's important.
How would you, with such a system, you wouldn't have the man on the street voting. You would still have the innovators, wouldn't you?
So this is why the system should contact you. right? If the system runs over something like mobile phones, then you get a phone call, and in most countries there's a pretty good penetration of mobile phones. So if you're calling a very poor country, only the middle class innovators will have phones. And in that instance, you'll get a very skewed result. If you're calling randomly into, say, a European country, just about everybody has a phone. So there's definitely a need to assess that factor and figure out how much you multiply out the votes. You need to make some kind of ability to do like sociological survey, but this is all within the domain of things that I think you need to build statistical compensation for. Mm-hmm.
My point is, in today's system, we vote for the innovators, the people that stand out, fight for political opinion, and so forth. With such a system, you would still have the vote from those people, but not the man on the street.
Yes, I see what you're saying. This is why you need to build a statistical model of what the man on the street thinks relative to the innovators. Right? So in the areas where you can only reach the innovators because they don't have phones, in those areas you need to do additional population survey work to get a really statistically significant result. Right? You're only ever going to get very narrow sampling through these systems. The question is one of how do you build open statistical models that expand those narrow samples into an estimate. And the critical thing is competition between different models, which are then tested by additional spending to do additional research. That's how we build models that are provably accurate. You do it by competitive analysis. But these are exactly the kind of effects that you'd be relying on your statisticians to compensate for.
That sums up the event here. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.